Christians are being persecuted around the world in record numbers, and that persecution is making its way west. What's driving it, and what can we do about it? Joining me to discuss is the Rome bureau chief for Breitbart and author of the new book, The Coming Christian Persecution: Why Things Are Getting Worse and What You Can Do About It. Please welcome Thomas Williams back to the program. Tom, thank you for being here. I want to start with the book where you write that Christian persecution reached an unprecedented level at the end of 2020, when 1 in 8 Christians experienced persecution and discrimination on average. Some 345 Christians are murdered around the globe each month because of their beliefs. And Pew Research found that Christians undergo harassment in 145 out of the 198 countries in the world, a significant higher number than just about any other single religion. Which countries do you think are the most dangerous to be a Christian today, and why are we seeing Christians targeted there?
Well, this is really kind of the sleeper story of the decade, Raymond. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that, because these statistics are real, and it's something that most people are simply unaware of. And to give you one example, you're asking where it's particularly dangerous to be a Christian. Let's take the example of Nigeria, where it is most likely, if you're a Christian, that you will actually be killed for your faith. This is something that there are deaths on a weekly basis in Nigeria, so much so that it's not even reported by news outlets anymore because it's just so commonplace. And in this case, it's driven, as we know, by Islamic extremism, the radical Islamic. There's the Boko Haram movement up in the north. You've got the Fulani Raiders in what they call the middle belt in Nigeria. But it's extraordinarily dangerous. There are attacks with machetes, and buildings and villages, entire villages are torched when it's known that Christians live there. It's something that is targeting specifically people who share a Christian belief.
Many Christians, especially those living in the U.S. and Western Europe, would not see themselves, Tom, as persecuted or discriminated against. What would you say to them? What are they missing here?
Well, I think there are two things, Raymond. One is we have to stand shoulder to shoulder with our brothers and sisters around the world who actually are suffering violent and aggressive persecution. Secondly, at least from my vantage point, it's even more disturbing what I see happening in the West, where the attitude toward Christians is evolving so quickly at such an accelerated pace that now Christians who used to be kind of the backbone of society, was looked upon as a good thing to be a Christian. Now Christians are often tarred as bigots, as homophobes, as people who are closed-minded, intolerant, narrow-minded, obscurantists, all these different things we hear flung at Christians just because we believe in Jesus Christ and believe in the moral teaching of the Bible.
I want to look at Europe for a moment. We have seen in the past several years, I've seen it myself, I know you have, in France, Germany, recently in northern Italy, churches being desecrated and even destroyed. Who is doing this, and why do we not hear more about these attacks in the media or an outcry from the Christians in those countries? They seem to just kind of be very blasé about this destruction happening in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities.
Well, that's interesting because the government actually has a policy. Take the example of France. They have a policy to not reveal the motivations behind these attacks. They don't want you to know what is causing them. And so there's a lot of speculation. We know that in a number of cases, there is, again, Muslim extremism. In the case of profanation and desecration, both of churches and of burial grounds, of cemeteries. But also there's a radical form of secularism that really sees religion, and Christianity in particular, as really an obstacle to progress, an obstacle to the agenda that they wish to promote. And so a lot of the aggression against Christians is also coming from that sector.
I want to move on to something that I read recently from Bob Fu. Now, he's president of a watchdog group, China Aid. He's a convert to Christianity. He was imprisoned in China for leading an underground house church and not registering with the Chinese Patriotic Association. In a recent interview, he said he was seeing the same tactics in Western nations that the Chinese Communist Party uses to crack down on churches, and that sometimes the tactics used were straight out of the Chinese Communist playbook. He said, quote, "The U.S. is increasingly exhibiting dictatorial attitudes both culturally and politically, by censoring speech, enforcing woke culture, and not tolerating dissent. I saw the governor of California basically prescribe and order the church to shut down and say not only when they can worship, but how. The ways that he threatened to punish those churches and pastors sometimes were word for word exactly the same as the CCP is using against the Chinese churches, end quote. Your reaction to that connection, Tom?
Well, I find it incredibly disturbing, but I think Bob Fu is exactly right. I read his stuff, too, and I also follow very closely what's happening with the churches in China. It's been called an Orwellian surveillance state because they have cameras put up in churches. They now have an app, a government app, that you need to register with, and you need to get permission every single time you want to go to church. There's no blanket permissions. It has to be every time. So they know what church you're attending, how often you go, and they also know the content of what is being preached, and they make sure that it has to cohere with the Maoist ideology behind the Communist Party there. We're seeing the same thing in the United States in the sense that there have been all these revelations in recent weeks about the FBI, first targeting pro-life protesters. Secondly, that document about Latin mass goers as somehow being likely to be white supremacists and tied to Christian nationalism. And so, giving them a right to also plant listeners, plant people, agents dressed undercover in churches to listen to what is being preached. Exactly the same thing we see in China.
Yeah. Tom, you're the Rome correspondent for Breitbart. You've covered the Vatican for several years. I want to talk for a moment about that Vatican-China deal, which we've reported on extensively. Why would the Vatican make a deal with communists rather than call them out for the suffering they inflict on persecuted Christians, especially those in the Catholic flock? And beyond China, why do you not hear more from the Holy See on this topic of persecuted Christians globally?
Well, this is an enormous problem, as you know, and I'm sure I share in your evaluation of what the Vatican has done in this case, and I think it's atrocious. I think you really have thrown the very faithful Catholics in China, that 6 million to 12 million number of underground Catholics who have always been faithful to Rome, and suddenly they no longer have the support of the Holy See. And it's absolutely terrible. And it's leaving many of them completely out in the cold because now it looks like they're obstinate because they don't want to join the Catholic Patriotic Association, which is government-run and which has always been hostile to Rome. They consider themselves an independent church. So I think the motivations behind it, if we want to listen and just take the Vatican at its word, it's this idea of culture of encounter and dialogue. It's better to be sitting at a table than, standing looking at each other from across the room. But the problem is what we've seen since 2018 when this agreement was first signed, things have actually gotten worse, not better for Christians in China. There is more persecution, there's more abuse, and there's more surveillance going on of everything that's happening.
Yeah, well, when you're seated at a table where they're slaughtering the people that are in your flock, that's not a table you probably should be sitting at. But just to finish up, Tom, as a follow-up, why the reluctance, do you think, on the Vatican's part for speaking out about these global atrocities of persecution happening, whether it be in the Middle East or in China or in other parts of the world?
Well, I think that the Pope himself, he reports on and he criticizes certain abuses, and then he is silent about others. And it really depends on what his relationship is with the people behind it. I think that's unfortunately the truth of it. For example, back in 2016, 2017, when there were these cases of slaughters by the Islamic State and others, that was a time when the Pope was saying there's no such thing as Muslim persecution. This is not something that Muslim terror groups do not exist. He was saying if we talk about that, then we have to admit that there are Christian terror groups and we're just as bad as they are. There are certain things he doesn't want to acknowledge because he doesn't want to offend those particular groups. China is another great example of that. He has not even been willing to call out the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region there, simply because he is unwilling to do anything that could irritate the Chinese and make them stand up from the table when he's desperately looking for diplomatic relations there. In
your book, you write that things will get worse before they get better. And you say, quote, as the number of those who hate Christians or hold them in contempt is growing, Christianity in the West is flagging, and the will to speak out against Christian persecution or even acknowledge its existence is waning. And though the enemies of Christ, radical Islam, virulent secularism, atheistic communism, grow stronger every day, the determination to resist them is flagging. Why do you think it's flagging, Tom? And you point out that radical secularism is a far greater threat in the West than, say, radical Islam.
Absolutely. That's exactly the way it is. That's the central thesis of this book, is that we're seeing right now a perfect storm of Christian persecution, because the drivers of persecution, whether it's Hindu nationalism in India, whether it's radical Islam, whether it's this growing, very, very hostile form of secularism in the West, these are all getting stronger by the day. And the will to resist, and especially the appreciation for religious freedom as the first freedom, as the most important of human rights, is something that is dwindling and dying. Because we see, for example, in the West, we see the LGBT lobby, we see the abortion lobby, we see groups that do not want Christians to be able to speak about biblical morality because they find it offensive to the agenda that they are trying to push. And so I think that you're seeing, and Christians themselves are finding themselves, weakened, and they don't want to speak out, and they don't want this ostracization that they're facing, and so they prefer to accommodate.
There's also been a rise in the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the non-affiliated, non-religious people in the United States. They now make up over a quarter of the population, 28% in 2021. What effect do the nuns have on acceptance of traditional Christian values and appreciation of the religious liberty you just mentioned?
Well, I think the nuns, unfortunately, religious liberty becomes less important for them than other basic liberties. They see churches and they see Christianity in general as just another voluntary association with no particular status deserving any care that is the founding fathers believed that it should have. I mean, I find it appalling. We're a nation that's founded on religious freedom, where we have the pilgrims. We call them pilgrims because they came in search of a place where they could worship God freely and practice their faith in a tolerant situation. And now we have the West turning in on itself, and particularly in the United States, which has always been a very, very religious people, we're finding it less and less so. I saw when that number of nuns crossed over the 1/4 mark, that's extremely disturbing, because these are people with not only no affiliation, but no appreciation often.
Yeah. When you look at the patterns, Tom, as you have for this book, when you look at the patterns of Christian persecution, how does it evolve, and how is it made acceptable to the populace?
Well, I think the way it evolves is you have to demonize a group before you can persecute them. You have to make them look bad. You have to make them look like the enemy. So you have cases where Christians are more and more called narrow-minded, bigoted, hateful, white supremacists, Christian nationalists, theocrats, all these different slurs used against Christians, so that ordinary people who didn't really care one way or the other before start seeing Christians as the enemy, as someone who's really getting in the way of a free America the way they understand it. That's always the first step, because that then allows you to become more aggressive, to become more marginalizing and more ostracizing in your treatment of Christians to begin with. And that discrimination then easily passes on to something worse.
Very good. We will leave it there. The Coming Christian Persecution, Why Things Are Getting Worse and How to Prepare for What Is to Come by Tom Williams is available at bookstores everywhere and online. Tom, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Raymond.